Hello, it's this week's Liverpool.com podcast. It's Dan Morgan, Joel Rabinowitz, Matt Addison and David Lynch on this momentous day. And where else to start but Alisson Becker's 94th minute winner at the Hawthorns after Liverpool beat West Bromwich Albion 2-1. Matt, it's ecstatic. It's boys' own stuff to coin a Barry Davisism. It's in many ways essentially Liverpool in the maddest sort of Liverpool way possible you could imagine.
Yeah, the maddest thing possible in the maddest possible season, I think, isn't it? It's Alisson Becker's biggest save for Liverpool. Just kept them in it, really, hasn't he? I mean, yeah, wow. I mean, it's hard to put it into words, isn't it? Even, we're recording this nearly 24 hours after it happened, and you still can't quite believe that it did happen. I've watched it back a few times now, obviously, and every time it pops up, you click on it and you go, he's surely not going to score, is he? But then he does. And yeah, it's just one of those moments that I think as long as Liverpool get the job done, and that is the important thing, they've got to, conclude this season and get themselves into the top four. But as long as they do that, it's just something we're going to talk about and remember. And it's going to be one of the iconic things, not just for Liverpool, but in terms of the Premier League and football more generally. I think it's one of those moments that you just, every time a goalkeeper goes up, you think, surely not. But on this occasion, thankfully, it was the case. It does go in, and it's a brilliant header as well. It's not even like a scuffed effort. It's an absolutely perfect technique to head it in. And yeah, you feel for Nat Phillips just an inch in front of him because it could have been his moment. But yeah, Alisson Becker it was.
I mean, Dave, it's important to say we weren't here last week, so we haven't spoken about Manchester United. And I think that's important to say, as Matt references, that in both of those games, we've been able to enjoy it again. And we've been able to enjoy, Liverpool looking like they're enjoying playing football. Liverpool attacking well at times at Old Trafford. And then you go through the game against West Brom, and at times it's agonising, it's pulling teeth, and it's back to some of the feels that we've had throughout this season. But the way in which it ends and the way in which the last two games have ended, we've just been reminded, I think, about what it is we actually get from this team and this manager at its best. And yesterday's ending was stuff that none of us could ever begin to sort of envisage in terms of how you would want a game to finish in a perfect scenario. But at the same time, I think the wider picture is important, regardless of how the season finishes, is that in those two games, and despite how bad the season has been, we've had a reminder of just how good it can get.
Yeah, I think on your point about enjoyment, across the 90 minutes, I'm sure there's a few Liverpool fans who might dispute that one, to be honest.
Yeah.
Two stressful games back to back there, I think. But do you know what it was? I think you look at so many games this season that have been similarly stressful and then have had a gut punch at the end, an absolute, conceding a late equaliser, or, I'm thinking Brighton where they give away that late penalty, or Leeds or Newcastle United, those games where Liverpool have been on the edge and it's been tough, but you're thinking, just get through this. And obviously then it's ended in disappointment. So you just look back on those games with nothing but, sadness and disappointment, really. And for these two back to back, for them to have that payoff of obviously it wasn't a winner in Salah's case at Old Trafford, but it felt very much like it with United pushing for an equaliser, just the brilliant payoff of that celebration, and then to go to West Brom and win it in the way that he did. It's just, a little reminder that football isn't always completely cruel, because I think this season sort of felt like a bit of a test for Liverpool fans after how much they've enjoyed the 3 years prior to that. And it's just nice to see that the luck has slightly turned a little bit. And I think that comes into even little VAR decisions going their way for once has been nice. Yeah. It's been a nice change. So that just feels massive. And you just, like Matt says, I think these moments, they have to make sure they get in the top four now, to turn these moments into part of that story, to make sure that you don't look back on it with any regrets, or, it can be, that Alisson moment can be made even bigger if it's a goal that gets them into the top four and back into the Champions League. I think it would be such a waste if they can't just kick on and make that happen.
Yeah, we'll come on to that a bit later. I think you're completely right, by the way, in the moments that are going for Liverpool, in the sense that, I think Nat Phillips not getting a penalty against Manchester United doesn't become a defining factor, for example, or, you know, the West Brom disallowed goal, which was rightly disallowed, isn't sort of given contentiously, and we're all wondering why it wasn't this morning. And I think one of those things would have really kicked Liverpool down and probably put the final nail in the coffin this season. I mean, Joe, we had a chat this morning about the moment and about what we could write about today on the site, and you know, we both referenced that in many ways this is kind of it's an embodiment of Klopp and Liverpool. It's an embodiment of the moments that we will look back on at this manager's tenure and say, these are alongside, you know, Adam Lallana at Norwich, Divock at Everton, the obvious ones, Barcelona at home. These are the moments in which, you know, you'll cite that this manager took us on a journey, good and bad. And like you rightly referenced, yesterday was a game that, you know, wasn't Liverpool playing for a Premier League title or a European Cup. It was a game which could help them finish in the top four, but still it felt so important. It felt massive, and it felt like part of Klopp's journey.
Yeah, it's a real kind of lesson, I think, about goal in what actually kind of matters in football, because we've always kind of been told, and people always say that trophies are kind of the ultimate currency of success, really. And obviously we've seen Liverpool win the biggest trophies they can win under Klopp. And I honestly can say I don't think I have felt a rush for any goal like that. And I include the ones against Barcelona, I include Origi against Real Madrid, Lovren against Dortmund, another one, you referenced Lallana against Norwich. I think that one yesterday, for the context of what we've been through this season with them, you know, us for work, writing about repetitive 1-0 defeats, 1-1 draws, all the supporters at home who had to watch all the games kind of by themselves, not had the communal experience of kind of heralding this team as champions, for them to go into that game off the back of a United one, and then for it to kind of peter out to a 1-1 draw, it just would have been so hard to stomach, really, because then you go into Burnley and Palace relying on other results, but probably knowing that the best you can hope for is Europa League, realistically. And yeah, that I just can't quite recall any other moment in my football watching life, really, that compares to it, because it's not only the fact you've seen goalkeepers score. I think it probably happens, every 5 or 6 seasons, you maybe get one in the Premier League, but you never get them scoring a header, and you never get it in the 96th minute. Then you never get it in a game which is must win and could define a season like that. And especially given, obviously, the personal tragedy that Alisson's been through this season, the impact that will have had on him, the way he spoke afterwards, the reaction as well of his teammates. And you've got players there like, I don't think I've ever seen Salah react to one of his own goals like he did. He was going ballistic. Yeah. Thiago was pretty much in tears on the floor. Firmino was going crazy. Nat Phillips as well, who's obviously been a huge part of the story this season. It was quite something. I don't think we'll probably ever see anything quite like it again.
It's a really important point to mention the measure of the man, and he's clearly gone through incredible turmoil that I think is rightly none of our business in many senses. But I think what deserves noting is that it's been played out on such a public stage, because he's had to go to work, and his version of work, if you like, is performing in the public eye every week in front of thousands upon thousands of people. And, you know, when we talk about characters and when we talk about people and footballers who, you know, we can relate to, Joel, there is a sense with this Liverpool team that despite not knowing them and despite never being able to know them as people, you can really relate to them as honest, hard working and decent looking people from the vantage point we have as supporters, as people who invest in a concept of football and footballers. It's quite a unique thing.
Definitely. There was a really nice interview, I don't know if you've seen, with Robertson after the game yesterday, where he speaks about the impact the thing with Alisson's father had on the whole squad, because obviously they're all so close, and as much as it obviously impacted him the most, it's something that they've all gone through. And obviously there's quite a strong Brazilian, Portuguese-speaking contingent in the squad who are obviously close off the pitch as well. So they'll have felt it. They'll have known what that goal meant to him. And yeah, it's been difficult with Alisson, because you want to analyse the performances and the footballer, and he has had some poor moments this season. Obviously, the Man City game stands out, where he kind of is responsible for 2 goals in a couple of minutes, and there's the penalty against Burnley as well. And there's been a few others where his distribution has been questioned, and you want to kind of assess the footballer, but then it's also impossible to kind of imagine having to do your job where you know that every single minute detail is going to be analysed afterwards. That must be so difficult. And yeah, to see him is really refreshing. You don't often see footballers speak that kind of raw, really, in front of a camera about something that is so personal like that. And it was nice to kind of, you could sense the relief, I think, in him, because I don't think he's done any interviews really since it happened. It felt like a real sort of cathartic moment for him as well. And yeah, so pleased after the season he's had. And yeah, just got to hope that they do it for him now in his last 2 games, because you just want to be able to look back on that whenever the end of Klopp's tenure is. That will be kind of one of the landmark moments if it does keep him in the Champions League for next season.
Matt, what did you make of the game itself? Was you of the opinion that it was clearly a difficult performance for Liverpool in certain aspects? It was always going to be. But did you feel like they were unlucky not to sort of have the game out of sight, given some of the chances they had second half? I think I counted this morning, there was 13 attempts in the second half and 3 on target. There's the obvious one with Trent on his left foot that you think the goal's gaping, and there's other bits in there too. I mean, how would you sum up the performance in general?
I think it was pretty similar, to be honest, to a lot of performances that we've seen in this calendar year, in that Liverpool did okay, as you say. There was lots of good things. I think Thiago was excellent at creating the chances, but it just never quite felt that they were going to do something. I think when Alisson does score, it was kind of like, well, nobody else was seemingly going to do it. I think when Wijnaldum had a chance about 60 seconds before that he should have done a little bit better with, and it just felt like one of those days, really, that Liverpool had tried everything and nothing really had come off. I mean, even the Mohamed Salah goal kind of came from nothing. It wasn't a clear-cut opportunity. It wasn't one where they'd sort of fashioned a chance and he'd finished it perfectly. It was one that was kind of a bit of a snapshot, if you like, and it was just a difficult performance all round. I think Liverpool made it slightly more difficult for themselves. I think there was a few sort of scary moments at the back, if you like. I think, maybe Reece Williams did slightly better than Nat Phillips. Quite often it's been the other way around, I think, for Liverpool in recent weeks. But there was enough there to think that they could just snatch a goal. Obviously, no one expected it to come in the way that it did, but there was kind of chances coming without any real conviction. And that, as I say, has just been the story of Liverpool's season in front of goal, particularly, I think. So it wasn't a perfect performance by any stretch. It certainly wasn't the worst that they've played this season. I think there was certainly very positive bits. I think Thiago was probably the pick of those positives, but there was never really any conviction in terms of watching that game that you thought, there was never any kind of inevitability that they were going to score it. It kind of felt like if they were, it would have to be something a little bit mad. I know I was speaking to Guy, who obviously works on Blood Red with us, and he was kind of saying, well, do you just throw Origi on with 10 minutes to go, or just do something mad and just try and change something? Because it didn't quite feel like it was going to happen. In the end, obviously, it happens in a mad kind of way, and that basically was what had to happen. It didn't ever feel likely, but Liverpool did, obviously, in the end, just about find a way to do it.
I think that's important to note, Dave, isn't it? That Liverpool they're stumbling over the line, no matter how you look at it. Ozan Kabak now, we know, won't play for the final 2 games. Diogo Jota is ruled out for the rest of the season. I mean, if you look at this squad now on paper in terms of who's missing, it's absolutely horrendous. And you see yesterday that, okay, Gini Wijnaldum comes on quite late in the game. Xherdan Shaqiri is the only other change. You would imagine with a fully fit squad, the manager would have made the final change and maybe done some activity from the bench beforehand. But he's clearly feeling hamstrung by who he has available and doesn't at the moment, who he can sort of rely on to get him through the last games. And I mean, he really is banking on a group of sort of 12 to 14 players now, isn't he, to get him over the line?
Yeah, and I suppose, to be honest, that's no bad thing in this period, just because we're 2 games left, aren't we? I suppose, tiredness now, we're that close to the end of the season, and the goals are so close that I think, I don't think that's a major issue. It is just in those games when you think in terms of being able to change things off the bench. I presume, Jota could have even started that game, couldn't he, if he was available yesterday? But if not, that would have left you with one forward option on the bench that would of really, really high quality and a guaranteed source of goals. And Liverpool know they're not going to have that now. I think Shaqiri, for all his qualities, is, sometimes his sub appearances, he can be a bit rushed in his play sometimes when he's brought on to sort of find that little extra touch that will bring Liverpool a goal. Sometimes I thought he was a bit like that yesterday, to be honest. And yeah, it's going to be difficult with the options he's got. I think his biggest worry will be about what's happening at centre half. The fact that he knows that between, across those two remaining games, that he's really going to have to protect Nat Phillips and Reece Williams. And I thought that game yesterday was probably the first real obvious sort of game where it's been clear where their weaknesses are, and it's the first time really that the team has regularly exposed them over the course of a match. I think Liverpool have been quite good at sort of mitigating for that weakness for a lot of the games, whereas West Brom were really good at sort of turning the centre halves, getting them running out wide and pulling them in behind into the areas where the fullbacks would typically be, and then trying to expose that space. I thought Liverpool did well to sort of limit West Brom's chances, to be fair, but there were moments where they looked uncomfortable, and I think that's, as much as anything, I think that's probably his biggest worry is, particularly going into Burnley, is those centre halves, and that's going to be a huge test of them. But what they have got available to them is still a lot of quality. You still start in that famous front three in these next two games, aren't you? You've still got a midfield that's starting to really function and look good, particularly Thiago. I thought his last two games are probably his best for Liverpool so far, in my opinion. So you'd like to think there's enough there, wouldn't you? And I think that's the way Klopp, being as sort of positive-minded as he is, he will be looking at it as well. He's just maybe that little worry at centre-half, but he'll think he's got enough there to protect that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of key performers in this run, Joel, who are clearly sort of willing Liverpool over the line. I think you can put the goalkeeper in that. But I think, Thiago, Mohamed Salah, who's been a consistent throughout the season, I think, at each individual times, they're all sort of deciding that they need to drag Liverpool a little bit over the line and give a little bit more as individuals. And that's needed from this squad now. And it's going to be needed in the final two games too, that, hopefully maybe another player Sadio Mane, for example, can say, well, I'm going to get hold of this game tonight and I'm going to make sure we don't lose. I'm going to make sure we win. But you look at Thiago and Trent in particular in the last couple of games. I had a look today from yesterday. I mean, they pass to each other the most, as opposed to anyone else on the pitch from a Liverpool point of view. And when you watch the game and when you study it, the eye tells you that a lot of what they're doing is progressive. A lot of what they're doing is the right pass, and it might look sort of basic, but it's a pass that isn't leaving a player going backwards to retrieve it. It's 2 yards in front. It's telling a player where you want him to be. It's putting information on the pass, and they're doing a lot of the right things. But yesterday in particular, I thought Thiago's use of the ball and his calmness on the ball in particular was superb.
Yeah, I thought he was great again yesterday. I mean, the whole thing about him not getting an assist, that one in the first half where there's a lovely piece of interplay where I think Fabinho puts him in on the right-hand side and he cuts it back, and it was one of many chances that Liverpool should have done better with. Mane kind of has the whole goal really to aim at, and his body position is a bit strange, and he ends up sort of firing it past the near post instead of a cross goal, and it would have been an easy finish if he'd done that. But yeah, Thiago, it just felt like everything was possible really when he had the ball. He's, I think, noticeably in the last couple of games against United and yesterday, he's been on the ball higher up the pitch, much closer to the front three. I think that's been quite clear. Obviously, having Fabinho back helps that. And there was one point in the second half as well where he feeds it in behind between the West Brom centre-back and left-back to Trent, and it just looks like it's a little bit overhit, but Trent is ready for it, and he just gets it on the byline, and he ends up trying to hook it back, and it gets cleared, I think, in the end. But brilliant ball, and it just felt like those two in particular really were just not standing for the idea that Liverpool weren't going to win. I mean, Trent, there's a report this morning from The Athletic saying that Southgate still probably isn't going to take him, which is just, when you consider how influential he's been over the last couple of months, really, I'd say he's not only been one of Liverpool's most kind of consistent performers over this period since the results have picked up. He's up there with the best players in the league at the moment. Almost every single game you come away thinking he could have easily had 2 or 3 assists, and the guy's playing right back, and it's crazy watching him, thinking that there's an England manager there who's going to take 3 players in his position and potentially not him. Not to kind of get sidetracked on the England thing, but I think just to kind of put into context how good he has been. I think we've seen really since, I'd say even before the kind of March internationals when he was left out, he'd started to pick up a little bit then. And I think he's just continued that now. He's got something like 5 or 6 goals or assists in his last 7 appearances, which is crazy. And you go into the last couple of games talking about players who produce moments and drag the team over the line. You think he, even though he's ostensibly playing as a fullback, is as likely as any of them to win the game that will get Liverpool into the top 4, hopefully. You wouldn't be surprised at all if it's a Trent free kick or a Trent corner against Palace, which proves the difference, or against Burnley. And I think, having Thiago there is so useful, getting him into those positions where he can hurt teams.
Yeah, Matt, I mean, we're looking at the pitch now. As I said before, we're going to stumble over the line in terms of having bodies there to get into the squad. I mean, Jurgen Klopp said he's hopeful he can get Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain and James Milner back. Milner feels like a big one, I think, for Wednesday and Sunday. You know, if he can get him on the pitch at some point in both games, I think that'll be massive in terms of just what he can bring to Liverpool in any game state and any game situation. But, you know, is it, I guess what I'm asking is it unreasonable in some ways to expect Liverpool to win the next 2? They're quietly, as Joel wrote about last week, one of the informed teams in the league in terms of their points from the last sort of 24, 27. But, you know, these aren't easy games, and I'd even put Palace in that, with all due respect, even though Liverpool beat them 7-0 this season. Burnley away, despite how rancid they were against Leeds, is a game with supporters in the stadium they'll be up for, and having already beat Liverpool this season, feel like they can get something from.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. There's 2 difficult games that Liverpool have got to get through, and you know, as I think Joel said before, I think that the weakness of Liverpool's centre-backs kind of aligns with the strengths of what Burnley and Crystal Palace, really, with an informed Christian Benteke there. You know what they're going to do. They're going to put balls into the box. They're going to try and split the centre-backs. I thought it was interesting what Allardyce did last night with free kicks, when the goalkeeper was taking a free kick in and around his own penalty area. They sort of split the defence so that the centre-backs and the full-backs of Liverpool were sort of stretched all the way across the pitch to try and exploit those gaps and try and get the flick-ons. And I would imagine that that's something that Burnley and Crystal Palace have taken note of. I think if you can stretch this Liverpool defence, there is an opportunity to sort of get in behind and cause them problems. But it's up to Liverpool to sort of step up, and they will create chances against these teams, as much as you're slightly fearful of what they could do to Liverpool's backline. I mean, if you are Burnley, as you say, having just been so poor against Leeds over the weekend, if Leeds United can score 4 goals against Burnley, there's no reason why Liverpool can't create a similar number of chances. So for me, it comes down to the issue of what Liverpool have had so far this calendar year, of not taking the chances when they come. If they do that, if they fall, say, to Salah rather than to Mane, or things just go in Liverpool's favour in that regard, you can see them winning both of those games. And to be honest, I said it before, West Brom, if Liverpool can't beat West Brom or they can't beat Burnley, do they deserve to be in the Champions League? Probably not. So I think with the 2 games in front of them that they've got, on paper, they should win them. I'm reasonably confident that they can do that and find a way across, to get through these games, just because you do feel like they will create enough chances. There's enough players there playing well. I think we've seen enough from Thiago, from Salah, from Trent. It only takes sort of 3 or 4 moments from 3 or 4 players in a Liverpool shirt, and that should be enough for them to do it. So can they do it? Yeah, absolutely. Should they do it? Yeah, absolutely. But it's not going to be easy. Yeah,
I mean, Dave, that's a given, isn't it? With Liverpool, it's not going to be easy. They're not going to make it easy for themselves. They never do. And I think when we're sort of talking about Liverpool drawing on experience from winning the Champions League and the Premier League and the general Klopp journey, I think one thing that will serve them better than most is the concept of just worrying about yourself, just worrying about doing your own job and not getting caught up in the mathematics, the concept of we might need this result if this happens, and we might need that result if that happens. Liverpool will have a job to do themselves. And like Klopp has said, they need to put themselves in the best position. So they've been really good down the years at focusing on the next game, and they've got to now, for as good as that moment was yesterday, already be looking at Burnley and saying, well, like the guys have said already, if we don't get the job done here, then this has the potential to be in vain.
Yeah, I think in terms of focusing on the job at hand and knowing what results you need and things like that, I just can't imagine this squad with this level of experience and quality getting caught up in that idea. I think I'm right in saying that if Chelsea lose, then Liverpool could, against Leicester, then Liverpool could maybe get into the top four, couldn't they, with the draw at Burnley, and then they would know they only had to match Chelsea's result on the final day maybe. But I just don't think that comes into it, because I think Liverpool will know that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. This season is absolute proof of it. So, don't be going to Burnley thinking you can get away with a point and then, okay, we can just beat Palace at home, because it's just not going to work like that. Something will go against you. You'll get some sort of VAR madness, or another player will limp off injured, or a goal will go in off someone's backside. So I think that their job is clear, isn't it? It's just to go and try and win these two games, and it will be very, very difficult. The elation of yesterday's maybe already subsided, and you're already looking at that trip to Burnley with fans in, with a little bit of trepidation maybe. So yeah, I think they just know it's get as many points as humanly possible from both these games, and that will hopefully be 6. And if you know that if they do that, then only some sort of freakish goal difference swing will deny them a place in the Champions League. So yeah, it makes the job obvious. And plus, like you say, you alluded to the Klopp journey as well, that so many of these players were all involved in those top 4 chases prior to Liverpool winning the Champions League. So I think that will hopefully help them get over the line.
I mean, just to come back to you quickly, what do you see as being the implications going into next season, David, into the next 2 games? Is it going to massively swing one way if they do make it into the top 4 or they don't?
Well, I think for next season, I think it's obvious that, Liverpool, for example, are making absolutely no secret, are they, of the fact that they've got an interest in Ibrahim Konate at Leipzig, and that one of the big considerations about that deal is whether they can pay his release clause in a lump sum, which Red Bull would ask them to do. Now, it's quite clear, isn't it, that if they do qualify for the Champions League, that they will just go and do that, because that gives them certain financial guarantees. It doesn't mean that if they don't qualify for the Champions League, they won't do it, but it becomes a more difficult decision to do it. So, I think that's one of the early obvious implications for next season. I think the fact that they're going to be guaranteed European football, it would be very unfortunate to miss out on European football from here. I think would mean that, or in fact, actually, are they guaranteed European football? Just to check. I think, am I right in saying if Everton can't catch them, then maybe they would be in the Europa Conference League anyway?
I don't think Everton can catch them now.
Yeah,
so I think
they will be guaranteed European football anyway. So I think that means in terms of building the squad, that's a positive. Just in terms of knowing you're going to need a certain amount of players, and it makes it easier to put a big squad together. That even if they did miss out in the Champions League, they could do a season of Europa League, and then it would sustain them to hopefully get back in the Champions League that season. So I think that makes things easier. But yeah, I think Michael Edwards will be watching these next 2 games with a lot of interest, just knowing that it makes his job of putting a summer together that will restore Liverpool to challenging for titles much, much easier. And not worrying about cutting deals and paying payments up front and small instalments. I think just knowing that you've got that guarantee of revenue is absolutely massive for a club like Liverpool, who can't rely on the wealth that maybe a Chelsea and a Manchester City have got.
Yeah, I mean, Joel, it's a good point, isn't it? That Liverpool will need to plan. I mean, they'll also need to plan around the squad they've got now. And I think if you look at yesterday, for example, there's no Van Dijk, Gomez, Matip, Kabak, Henderson, Milner, Oxlade, Keita and Jota. And that feels like it's been the story the whole season. 20 points out of 24 in that sense, and carrying injuries in the way in which they have is a massive. It's a massive push from Liverpool. Do you wonder whether there's going to be a fair few of them maybe carrying the burden of this season into next, and potentially then having to be sort of considered in terms of not a heightened injury risk, but you wonder whether there's going to be some knock-ons for the likes of Robertson next season, who is going to go to the Euros with Scotland, has played what seems like every minute of a really condensed and hectic schedule season this season for Liverpool. They're going to have to bring in new players regardless, I think, is what I'm getting at here. And they're going to have to find a balance between who is fresh at the right time and depending on the competitions that they're in.
Yeah, I mean, Robertson's one. If you'd said at the start of the season when they'd signed the specialist backup left back that Robertson would end up, he started every league game so far, and he's obviously going to start the last two, which is mad. That can't keep happening, because Klopp was quite clear last summer that he said about him and Trent that will kind of impact their careers further down the line if they don't kind of have a way to rest these fullbacks at some point. But he's not the only one. Henderson, to be honest, is one that worries me a bit, especially with reference to the Euros. That same piece that mentions Trent potentially not getting picked says that it's quite likely that Southgate will take Henderson, even though he's obviously going to miss the remaining games for Liverpool, which just feels like a big gamble, because he's been out since February, I think it is, with the groin injury, which he obviously had surgery on. It's the second season in a row that he's kind of missed most of the run-in, because he obviously got that one against Brighton at the end of last season. So he missed the final few games of that one. And I had a look at his injury numbers over the last few seasons, Henderson, and kind of on the quiet, even though you don't necessarily regard him as injury prone in the same way that Keita or Sturridge used to be. He has missed an awful lot of games, and he's only getting older. Obviously, I think he turns 30 or 31 this summer.
31, I think.
Yeah, he's one who they are going to have to, I think, manage quite carefully and pick his games next season. The other question as well, in terms of just looking at summer business and players are kind of jaded and tired. Mane and Salah obviously are up there in terms of minutes played this season, but they've got the AFCON in January and February as well. So Liverpool are going to need a plan, because you can't envisage a scenario really, if we're hoping that they get rid of, not to say get rid of, that sounds insulting, but if they get good money for Origi and Shaqiri this summer, you can't really be going into kind of a month of next season with Jota, Firmino, Harvey Elliott as your potential kind of front three. Feels like we need to do something there, and obviously that impacts on who they sign, because players like Basuma, who've obviously been heavily linked, you have to account, but you wouldn't have him for a whole month of next season. Daka, another name people keep talking about, as Salzburg again, would be at the AFCON. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of planning ahead to be done there, I think, and some of these players will kind of benefit, I think, from a full summer off.
I just think to come in on the midfield point, it's an interesting one, particularly with Henderson, I think, because going into this season, I think earlier in the summer, there was a point at which it looked likely that, or possible that Wijnaldum might have gone to Barcelona, that they might have put in a bid in for his, a year out from his contract. Obviously would have been able to get him fairly cheap for what he is. Obviously they're likely to wait, and it's one of his possible destinations this summer, I suppose. But the idea was that, Liverpool was saying that maybe they wouldn't bring Thiago in unless one of the midfielders left. The idea was that they were maybe going to wait for those two things to line up. And what they did instead, obviously, was to not sign an extra centre-half, and they've been linked with a few of them, and just pack out the midfield and think that they would be able to use Fabinho as an auxiliary centre-half whenever they needed him. But going into next season, I actually think there's a case to be made, and I think Liverpool possibly will agree with this, to even though Wijnaldum's going, is not to just go with your current midfield numbers as was the initial plan. I think they will need to add to replace him in terms, you think they've been linked to Yves Bissouma at Brighton, who I think would be a fantastic signing, someone like that, and sign a centre-half as well, because I think they'll look at Henderson, like you say, quietly got an injury record that's maybe slightly getting worse. Obviously,
Milner as well.
We know his problem. Yeah, Milner getting older. Oxlade-Chamberlain's injury record isn't getting any better either, and there's no guarantee they'll be able to generate money by selling him this summer. So I think it is a point where they'll have to think, okay, maybe we do have to. It's not necessarily in Klopp's instincts to do this, but maybe we do have to pack out a couple of positions that we wouldn't usually do because of those injury records, because they don't want to ever be in this situation again where a season is ruined by injuries.
And that feeds all back into having European football, which we can kind of quite safely say they'll have at least Europa League now. I think it's very unlikely that they don't, because then, if you do pack out certain positions in the squad, there are going to be games where you can use players and just keep them kind of sharp rather than just leaving them on the bench. Whereas, you say if they had missed out, which kind of only a few weeks ago looked quite likely, then it becomes a case of having to cut down on numbers this summer purely because you couldn't keep a huge squad happy. So in that sense, it's really useful for Liverpool's plans going forward.
I think finally, Matt, I think a lot of this will come down as well to things that we don't know. So, you know, we know Klopp is an analytical coach. He's one who works in numbers as much as what his eyes tell him. But, you know, Liverpool have done incredible work around sports science, around data analysis, around nutrition. And they'll have a lot of information on why these injuries have occurred this season, why they are so persistent, why they've been so serious, and how they can maybe impact and improve that going forward. And someone like Naby Keita, for example, you know, you would imagine that the recruitment around is it Andrew Schlumberger, who they brought in earlier on the season as head of recovery. You know, you'd imagine there'd be conversations there around Keita as an example, as to say, well, you know, why does this keep happening at the times in which we really need him around, and times in which he's not getting any momentum from playing games, but at the same time he's getting injured when he's not in the fold. And Liverpool, I think the guys are right there. Liverpool can't have a situation like this happen again. They've got to study it, and they've got to use reasoned, you know, analysis on the debrief of this season that goes beyond merely just signing players and selling them and saying, sort of, we replace one with the other and hope that the, you know, injuries stay all right for us. They've got to go basically scratch beyond the surface a little bit and see why this is happening and how they can stop it.
Yeah, I've no doubt that will happen. I think they'll have already started that, to be honest, the process of looking back at injuries and things that have gone wrong this season and learning those lessons really going forward, just in terms of maybe it's been a slightly different workload this season. Maybe some players have had to play more minutes, certainly, than what they would have done because of knock-on effects. And I'm sure they will learn those lessons. And in terms of someone like a Keita or a Chamberlain, I mean, that links into the other aspect. It's not just transfers that it would sort of be important to get into the top four. It's in terms of contracts as well. It's in terms of, I think there's 8, 9, 10 players who've got 2 years left on their deals. Keita and Chamberlain this summer are 2 of those players. I think, you know, that's hugely important in terms of working out what you do. And I just think in terms of the whole sort of refreshing of the squad, the moving 1 or 2 players on, bringing a couple more in, I think if Liverpool had have missed out on the top 4, maybe that would have been slightly delayed. It's certainly not as easy to move players in and out. I know Jurgen Klopp would always say, well, the transfer plans wouldn't be impacted if they were in the Europa League compared to the Champions League. But I think it's hard to believe that would have had no impact whatsoever. I think that there are certain things that will have changed. And just in terms of the long-term plan, I think it becomes significantly easier, obviously financially, but in terms of other aspects as well, in terms of, you know, bringing players in, moving them out, trying to sort of sort out your squad, not just for next season, but moving forward, because I think that there are a lot of big decisions to be made on players this summer. I think Naby Keita is probably the obvious one to pick out, but there are others that have been at Liverpool long enough now that you've got a kind of body of evidence to suggest that if their injuries have been this severe to this point, they're probably not going to suddenly improve and get better moving forward. So, yeah, there's loads of big decisions, but getting into the top 4 in the Champions League, I think, certainly makes a lot of them a lot easier to make, and certainly sort of reduces the gamble moving forward.
All right, that's been this week's show. We certainly hope Liverpool can do it and make the Champions League, and we'll be back next week to discuss whether they did or not. But for now, a huge thanks to Joel, to Matt and to David. We're all off to watch Alisson Becker's goal to the theme music of Whitney Houston's I Will Always Love You. We'll see you next week. Take care, everyone.